So first of all, do you guys have any questions about me, or should I do a little like potted summary of an introduction?
Give us an intro. Tell us
Sure.
who you are.
So I'm Josiah Boornazian. For those of you that go to the University of Utah, it's Dr. Josiah Boornazian. So, but we're outside of school, so. I'm originally from California. I grew up in the Mojave Desert. Somehow got involved in big band jazz from the age of like 12. So I started out playing professional saxophone super young because my stepdad was a musician. I moved to Los Angeles to get my undergraduate degree in jazz saxophone performance. And already at that time, I was starting to get really interested in electronic music. If you guys are old enough to remember, back then it was, the primary style was called trance. That was really, really popular, you know, like guys like Cascade and that whole generation.
He's from here.
Yeah. So I started getting into electronic music, but I didn't really know what to do. So I used to take, I'm not making this up, I used to take Cascade tracks and arrange them for jazz sextet. So, and then I moved to New York and got my master's degree. And by that time, somebody had given me like a demo version of Reason. And I started taking some of my kind of groovier jazz compositions and programming them into Reason. And then I got sidetracked and I put all my electronic ambitions aside for several years because I got a master's degree and started teaching at the City College of New York. And at the same time, I mean, this was New York City and I was like in my 20s and poor. So at the same time, I was working backstage at Carnegie Hall, playing jazz gigs at night, teaching private lessons, teaching part-time at City College, and working for a small record label called Artist Share, which is the first fan-funded or crowd-funded record label of all time. And they're actually the first record label to ever get a Grammy for an album that had online sales only. It was a Maria Schneider record. For those of you guys who know Maria, she's a really hip jazz composer. So then I had like a kind of like a sabbatical year where I left New York and I was supposed to start my doctorate at the University of Miami. And I moved out to the West Coast and got credentialed and taught public school for a while and wrote a method book, jazz saxophone method book or improvisation method book. And then finally, around 2016, I ended up in the University of Miami, and I tried to resurrect my dead electronic projects that had been sitting on my hard drive for probably 5 or 6 years at that point. And so I gave up on Reason, and I got a copy of Ableton. I bought my first Ableton and with a student discount, luckily, because I was a grad student at the time. And I started taking some of my kind of groovier saxophone, jazz, electronic stuff that I had in my head and actually putting it down. So some of my first albums have singers, some of them have saxophone with effects. Oh no, I should add, while I was in New York, I had already started experimenting with analog pedals. So I bought some guitar pedals and I would run my saxophone through a microphone and then through the guitar pedals and into an amp. So that was kind of my electronic outlet for a while. And then I finally got Ableton, and over many years I shifted away from the sort of jazzier stuff into more straight ahead deep house. But then I also kept basically 3 streams going with my electronic music. I still do the saxophone with guitar pedals with effects, and I have a duo project with my colleague Alessandro Fedini on piano, and I also have a duo project with a drummer from Texas named Mark Ramirez. And we do nothing but free improvisation. So with Mark, I've also added Ableton. So I have two mics, and I route one mic through an interface into Ableton, and I'm doing saxophone with effects through Ableton, and I have a series of foot pedals that I can pull out if you want to check those out later. And so I do basically avant-garde electronic jazz improvisation with a lot of automated effects. And then I also do deep house, and then I also do just kind of modern jazz with my saxophone running through either Ableton or the effects pedals. And then about halfway through my degree at the University of Miami, I got brought into the electronic music faculty. So I was teaching in the jazz area, getting my doctorate in jazz. I was also teaching in the musicology area, getting my doctorate there, and then I also joined the faculty jury for Laptop Ensemble, and I studied with the head of the electronic music department at the University of Miami, Joe Labate, who's amazing. And so that took my sort of few years of dabbling with Ableton and shoving out records that didn't really sound very good to a whole nother level. And he taught me things that I still use to this day, including some of the stuff we're going to talk about. So I owe a big debt of gratitude to Joe Abadi. And then in the past few years, I've learned a lot more stuff, especially in the areas of sound design, mixing, mastering, production. So now I have, like I said, these 3 streams, pretty straight ahead deep house, which is what I'm going to cover today, avant-garde jazz improvisation with electronic automated effects, and then also straight ahead jazz, so which I sometimes, and then modern jazz, which I sometimes incorporate the effects. So I guess I'll start by playing a little bit of a set, and then I don't know how long do you want to play, or talk first, or play first? What do you think?
Can we do like 10-15 minute set?
Sure. So I'll dive into the top of this one, and I'll do a couple of simple things, and then we'll talk about some of the things I'm doing in the software to help me, and we'll talk about how this set is structured. I picked this one for today because it's very, very complicated signal routing, that allows me to have maximum flexibility with actually having really tight arrangements, but also being able to improvise within those arrangements. So here we go. I'm gonna reset my effects, and we'll start here. So a lot of stuff. So what we'll do is I'll talk about some general things that I have with this particular way of setting up a live set, and then we can maybe go in questions or dive into any of them in more detail. So some general things is, there's a lot of ways to set up a live set. This one I didn't do too much playing, but the first thing you have to decide is, do you want to have anything live MIDI that you can interact with? So in this set, and I have my own just completely random color coding system. I'm a big fan of color coding. So in this set, any vertical track that's red, with the exception of this brown one because it's nested in 2 red ones, vertical tracks, that's live MIDI. So it's something I can improvise with when I go to the note view on the push, right? So I can just switch between these. I have one over here on the right side as well. That's a synth as well. So, and let me reset all my effects as well, so we can hear my synths. So, that's the first thing you have to decide. With this one, I just kept 4 instruments, but that's enough to get a wide variety of sounds, especially if they're nested within effects racks. And so everything else are freezes and flattens of, completed tracks. So some people I know, like the very, very, very simple DJs, they'll actually have an entire bounce of the track, right? And they'll play, just let it run, and you can of course do that in session view or arrangement view. They'll let it run, maybe play with some effects, and then fade in the next track. Because I'm coming from a jazz background, as you guys now know, you've heard my history, I want a lot more flexibility with improvisation. So what I do is I take large chunks of a tune and I slice it and send it to session view. So do you guys know how to do that already, by the way? Cool. So you can set your loop, slice it, send it to session view, and then what I do is, depending on the type of section of music, if it's a main groove, if it's a drop, if it's a breakdown, I'll program in often follow actions because I want the music to progress, even if I'm playing around with something here, just in case I get sidetracked by something. I want the music to keep moving forward. But I also build in some sections that are just loops. So, and I'm a big fan of labeling as well. So as you can see with each new track, things they bounce back and forth between the center of the screen and the outer parts of the screen. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. So, I've labeled my BPM, the name of the track, and then this is an intro, right? This is a breakdown, drop, outro, a breakdown, a transition, and I give myself notes. So a lot of these are dummy clips, and I'm going to talk a lot about some interesting uses for dummy clips today. This is the simplest dummy clip. This is a completely blank dummy clip that's just reminding me that if I'm playing this section here, or this section, it's a reminder to go to my sync effects bus and kind of wash these in preparation to transition to the next tune. So the way I have it set up, because I know I'm going to be transitioning from one song to the next song in an improvised way, I want to separate each song onto basically 2 tracks. So I have an effects bus track here on the far right that says All Synths 1, and another one that says All Synths 2, and in the middle you can see All Drums. So all of my drum tracks are routed through this track here, which is basically just set, obviously, to monitor in. And I have an effects rack here that's nested in an Ableton chain so that all of my macros get routed directly to the push. And then I have the same thing for my synths here and my synths here. So the way I line it up is the first track is routed through All Synths 1, the second track through All Synths 2. So that if I'm playing around, if I'm messing around with my effects here, it's only affecting the rack for the first track. So if I decide to jump ahead to the next track, and scroll up here, which starts here, all of these clips are not going to have the hangover effect of all that fiddling I just did. So now you can see all the audio is coming in. There's only a little bit of audio left from a delay. So now all the audio is coming into this one. So I just go back and forth. First track goes in effects rack 1. So basically the odd numbers go in effect rack 1. The even numbers go in effects rack too. So that's a system that I came up with just because of my particular style of experimenting. And I'm also really, really OCD about like redundancies of also preparing for the next track. So as you can see in both of the, or actually all three of these, what are essentially effects buses that are routed to the master chain, I have a ton of grayed out clips. So they're all essentially, they're deactivated because these are not audio channels. But you can still, of course, program in automation. So my very first scene here is just a giant global reset, where no matter what I was doing, editing, messing around before, when it comes time to get ready for a performance, I'll hit this, and it stops everything. And for every single one of these, I've gone through and set, well, that's a MIDI one, so that's a bad example. I've gone through every single one of these and looked at my effects. So this one, for example, and I've just I've manually, so here's my effects chain. I've gone to everywhere that there's automation and manually reset it to 0. And by the way, for the overall effects racks, I have, there's multiple systems that I use. I use either a hair trigger or a gradual fade for the dry wet. This one happens to be a hair trigger. So it's very simple. I've programmed the dry wet to be a hard, basically 0 or 1, right? So anything below, anything 0 is off, the effects rack is bypassed, and any number higher. And so what that allows me to do is, so I'm looking at the, we'll do look at the drums one. So if I'm playing around with effects, I'll do like a wash and a delay, a little filter, right? If I want to just immediately drop that, wait, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, off, right? So that's only one system. You can also obviously, when you're looking at how you set up your effects racks, right? When you're looking at your routing, you can change those values. So that's just the way that I'm doing with this set. So does that make sense? The kind of the reasoning before that? And so every time I have to think about the composition and think about, well, where's a moment where no matter what's going on, I want to reset effects. So that's a lot of different scenes. So as you can see, these are the intro scenes. So I'm probably going to be messing around with a lot of stuff. So 3 times in a row for the next 3 scenes, I put in a dummy clip that just resets everything. So that if I happen to be playing with something, but I'm ready to trigger the next section of music, the next section is going to come in clean and tight, and like half my synths aren't going to drop out. So that's basically how I structure a set overall. And as you can see, I do a lot of follow actions, a lot of group editing with follow actions. So I select clips and make sure they're all the same time signature. And well, this one isn't going anywhere. But if we look at all these other ones, they all have the exact same follow actions. After 64 bars, they're going to jump down to the next clip. Now, when I'm doing even more improvisatory stuff, I'll have a block of clips that are separated with stop buttons on either side, and I'll set them to randomize. That's a feature that I like to have a little more unpredictability. So in this effects rack is pretty simple. I've just got kind of like a beat chopper, some basic DJ tools, a filter. So most of these tracks are pretty complete. And as you can see, I give myself a lot of notes, right? Transitioning from tracks to, in case I don't want to do it manually, I also will often program in a dummy clip that will send everything into a wash, into a delay, and then we'll reset that on the next scene. So for example, we're looking at automation to a wash delay, and then it'll fade back out so that effects rack will be ready for the next track. And then again, just as a redundancy, I even have a reset on the next one. So that's kind of how I structure things overall. And also, I haven't done it in detail on this set, but I also give myself performance notes. So if I had improvised some melodies on the second track, I've just given myself a note here that it's basically the only thing that sounds good the entire time are the black keys of the piano, right, which is our minor pentatonic from E flat. And that's because that song in particular has very, very kind of chromatic jazz harmony, and so it's almost impossible to to find one mode or scale. So the only thing that kind of works the whole time is a minor pentatonic. So that's kind of my general sort of summary. So are there any of these things that you guys want to dive into and look at, or any questions you have for me about my style or the programming of these sort of things, or yeah?
Are you using the same audio effect rack on both of your two auxiliary channels?
Yeah, in this one I am, just to keep it simple so that I know what I'm looking at. So I've basically just taken and stripped down some DJ tool racks and then nested racks within racks. So for example, this wash and fade knob is routed to this, which is a standard DJ tool preset that's in Ableton, and I just took out some of the features I don't want. So it's basically just an EQ and a delay. And so I nested that rack within my overall effects rack and just routed the master dry wet to the basically the second knob on the push in terms of my macros. So, but I do have different versions of effects racks. And then on the master chain, I just have mainly some utility stuff. I'm a big fan of compression because you never know what kind of speakers or audio you're going to be dealing with. And this one's a little bass heavy. I was getting a little bit of distortion today, unfortunately, even when I yanked down the bass. But that is super important for this style of music only, really, is the dynamic range is extremely low and everything is pumped extremely loud. So a lot of compression is really, really important. Otherwise, once you switch off of your home setup, very, very, very often you'll find that your mixes sound too soft and that things get lost if your dynamic range is too wide. So I very, very, very aggressively use multiband compression to solve that problem. And it's really made a difference in mixes just for this particular style. When I do sort of more avant-garde jazz improvisation with effects, I'm happier to have a wider dynamic range because that's the style. And I'll be playing with a live drummer who will sometimes be playing drums pianissimo and sometimes he'll be playing fortissimo. So I like to have a wider dynamic range. But the follow actions are super helpful for me. And you'll also notice, again, I'm a little bit obsessive with labeling. In order to have one scene go to the next, even when certain instruments drop out, my simple solution so that I can bulk edit my clips is to have empty clips, which is super simple to do. Let's say the drums drop out here, which is the case, but the kick remains in. I'll set all the follow actions I want for my kick clip, make sure the time signature is right, and then I'll just copy and paste it over into the drum channel and yank the volume down, and then label it as an empty clip so I don't accidentally stop it and think, ooh, I'm going to drop an instrument out. Oh no, nothing happened because it's a blank clip. So that allows me to then just, if I have to go back later and change the length of that section of that scene, right, I'll just can bulk edit those clips very, very, very rapidly and make sure that every track is following down when it needs to. And I also remove stop buttons often if I know that there's like a clip that I want to I can just let it loop, and I don't need to worry about stopping it. So, yeah, good question. With this particular set, none of my effects racks are really that different. Actually, I think I even use the exact same one on the drums. So, because like I said, this particular set has very, very polished and complete tracks, so I could almost just let it play and just kind of stand here and look cool, and it would probably sound pretty good. Some other sets are a little bit less polished, and in that case, you'll probably see wider variety of effects racks, and I'll spend more time manufacturing drops, for example. Whereas this one, the drops are built in, and I'll just kind of add to them. Or a couple times I wanted to skip ahead to a section, so I would manufacture a drop myself, right, by fading things out. Again, with usually really simple tools. I also have a sidechain plugin. I just use Kickstart, which is also a really cool effect when you use it on your drums, especially your kick. So the kick is basically sidechaining itself. So when you fade in, when you have a dry wet, and then you can fade in the sidechain, so the kick progressively loses the attack until it drops out altogether. So for example, if I solo the kick, that's my regular drums. Well, I'll leave the regular drum sound. So if I go to my drum effect rack here, I have a sidechain filter. Oh, well, that's why, because I'm soldering the wrong thing. Let me solder the bus. So now it's going direct to the speaker. There we go. Let's solder the bus. I should be getting my sidechain. Let me see why it's not. But anyway, that's interesting. But anyway, it's a non-standard thing, but it's basically just an alternate way to get a kick to drop out. There we go. There was just something stuck in the automation. I just had to reset the effects. So now you only hear the tail end of the kick. Right. And then if I really wanted to, I can change and make it even more aggressive. And then again, using the hair trigger, if I wanted it to not be gradual, I can go back to the master macro and drop it out that way. So now at that point in the composition, everything's being sent to a filter. That's why you didn't hear the kick drop back in, by the way. It's heading to a drop. So other than that, nothing super crazy with effects. I focus really on polishing a composition and having it be a standalone track. And then the hard part is actually deciding how to dice it up. I used to have more scenes where each scene would basically be only like a 4 or 8 bar loop. But I found I was spending too much time having to go back to session view and kind of keep triggering scenes, even if I programmed a lot of follow actions. And so now, and also for the complexity of the set, for the sake of reducing that, as you can see, this is already a huge set, and I think it's only got about eight tracks. So also for maintaining just the visual simplicity of me keeping track of where I am. And that's where color coding becomes really important. I kind of broke my own rules on this one a little bit because I had to do a lot of but I had to do a lot of after the fact editing. But in general, my kind of loose code is red scenes are drops, and greens are either like transitions or breakdowns. And then the other colors I just insert so I have variety. So when I'm going between the computer and the push, I can see very clearly like, okay, here's my drop, right? So the drums are still soloed. Right, so. Cool. Other questions, things you want to look at? And was there anything I said today that was like actually new that you didn't know how to do, or you knew how to do everything that I talked about?
It's just well put together.
Yeah, you had something else.
I like how you're sending your different groups into those buses and putting all your effects racks on those buses. Because sometimes I get overwhelmed with trying to do that same thing but across like a bunch of different tracks and trying to manage that and keep that all together.
Yeah, and it also saves you on CPU as well. As you can see, and this is a really old computer. This computer is maybe 5 or 6 years old. And I'm not using a lot of CPU. And part of that's because a lot of these are frozen and flattened clips. But also part of that is because there's really only 4 live MIDI instruments, and I really only improvised on one of them today. And then only 3 essentially effects racks. And then everything else is routed to the master, and I keep my master chain pretty clean. Just a utility, a limiter, a couple forms of compression, and then very simple EQ8 for me to make maybe some last minute mixing decisions. So that saves a lot on CPU, which, as you guys know, is a problem unless you have a super expensive computer. It's a problem as your sets get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And especially, like I said, if you want a large set like this that has this built-in flexibility to jump around. So this last song here is a little bit more of an example of my slightly older style or approach of structuring, where I'm doing a lot more like manual cueing of each section. Right. So relatively few follow actions. And I have to cue everything myself. And this one, no follow actions. So I can sit here and groove however I want. So I would create some sort of transition to get to that section. Something's got a very, very, very long feedback delay trail there. Oh yeah, it's probably the main Plex synth over here. So and I also it's hard to do because not every track is structured the same way, but I also try to label and group audio clips vertically. So this track, most of the clips in here are arpeggiated synths. Most of this one are like secondary chords. These are main chordal synths. As you can see, if I have like a mid or a high bass, this is basically subs, leads, and then the middle block here that I've labeled all orange are the transitional tracks that are being routed through the second effects bus. So that's kind of how it's visually organized. So, cool. Any other questions? I know you guys were going to talk about operator this month too.
Okay,
If
questions
we
before we move
have
on?
time, we don't really have to.
It's pretty flexible.
Yeah, you can keep going if you want, really.
Cool. Well, there's a couple directions we can go. It depends on what you guys are interested in. We can look at a completely different set that's set up for like avant-garde electronic improvisation if you want, or we can look at a track, talk about mixing, mastering, or I know that operator is something you guys are going to be checking out too. We can check out operator. Yeah.
I actually do have one more question just on this.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some of these tracks you started from a composition that you already had and then prepared, chopped them and prepared them in session view for the live set.
Yeah.
So normally you start in arranging view and you do a longer track.
You mean when I'm composing?
Yeah.
So actually, no. It's like sonata form. It's an ABA. It's a journey. I start home, I go away, and I come back. I always work in session view. So I do all of my composing in session view, and then I record from session view to arrangement view only when I'm ready to start editing something that's going to be prepared for a final bounce. So then I export that, release it as an album. Then when it's time to put those tracks into a set, I'll freeze and flatten it, save it as a separate file, so that I can always go back to the original. So before I freeze and flatten it, I save it as a separate file. So I can always go back and edit the original if I have a different concept of mixing down the road, which has happened. I've actually remixed part of this set because some of these tracks are 4 or 5 years old and some of them are only like 4 weeks old. And so that I wanted the mixes to be a little more cohesive across the total set. So, and then once they're freezed and flattened, yeah, I'll just find a section that seems like it's coherent, loop it, and Ableton has a feature to slice and send it to its own scene automatically. So, and then I'll go in and just from this project view here, I'll drag and drop the clips from the freezed and flattened after they've been sliced, drag and drop them into my main set and organize them how I want, and then edit the follow actions. So
as you're preparing stems for a live set, are you bouncing them post effects? Because obviously you're not getting any master effects. So do you have to compensate for like volume and things like that?
yes, good question. So what I end up doing is with a and maybe the easiest way to do this is let's look at one. So let's go to my library and let's find one. So as you can see, I labeled them freezes. So no, I don't need to say any changes. So yeah, so because I very, very, very often use return tracks. Obviously, like you said, when you are dealing with stems on an individual track basis, you don't get any of the information, any of the data, any of the sound that's going to those returns. So I also use automation, as you can tell. So in my reverb return track here and my delay return track, I've got automation, because sometimes after a drop, I might filter the return track so it doesn't interfere, filter it out so it doesn't interfere with the drop as it's progressing. And sometimes, depending on how aggressive a drop is, I'll want more or less feedback on the delay that I've just sent all the synths to as I'm washing them out. So what I'll do is I'll have all the individual tracks out, and then I also bounce as a complete file just the audio that's coming from the return track alone, pre-master. And then I also have to add that in, so I have, again, another track that's basically my return tracks, and splice them up and make sure that they are the same length and have the same follow actions as everything else, because otherwise you're missing post effects, because I basically, that's the only effects that I use. Most of my effects are directly on the track, even on my completed bounces. Again, my master chains are generally pretty clean. I usually only have a compressor, a limiter, occasionally an EQ, but that's basically it. Compressor and a limiter. So I try and really fine detail, mix and balance everything before it even gets to the master. So, and that does make this process easier. So most of the tracks have most of the effects on them except those return tracks, and I use return tracks a lot for transitions in this style of music. So here's a classic example of that. We have white noise as well as synths and drums being sent to reverb and delay. So that would be completely missing from the my live set if I didn't manually go in and just bounce just my reverb and my delay as individual tracks.
So you bounce all of the return effects into one stereo file, or do you have like your A, your B, your C?
I do them individually. Yeah. I have the A and the B. Mm-hmm. So because sometimes, again, I might want to leave one of them out of a scene.
So
but
you could like perform it yourself or something?
Yes, exactly. So I could choose to trigger it or not trigger it. Right. Yeah. Or sometimes what I'll do is if I have an intro, sometimes I'll double or triple it and just yank down the volume of certain clips. And so sometimes I'll do that with the return. So the very first intro is the intro without the transitions. So I can loop it and play around some more effects myself. And then when I'm ready to go on to like the more polished transitions where I don't have to worry about it, or maybe if I even just want to improvise, I'll trigger the next scene where those return tracks are there with the follow actions and the audio is turned up. So.
Do you ever find yourself having to adjust things? So let's say you've pulled a bunch of tracks into one live set, into session view. Do you ever find yourself having to adjust things in the mix so that they sound more cohesive with the single master chain you have on your live set?
Yes, absolutely. I even did that a tiny bit today when I was warming up, because just for whatever reason, this studio monitor pair was really, really pumping the bass more than I'm used to hearing, and it was distorting a little bit. So in a couple of tracks where I know the bass is already really pushing up on the audio limit, and not just obviously of decibels, but of saturation. And I'm also a huge fan of saturation for the reasons we talked about earlier of really filling out the audio spectrum so that your track, when you slap it on speakers or when you export it to to publish it in public, you want it to sound, for this style at least, you want it to sound as loud as possible without distorting. And so there's an auditory illusion that happens when you really, really saturate. But when you get too bassy of speakers, that saturation can work against you. You can get some distortion and other issues. So yes, I definitely post mix, and again, sometimes I might go through and I'll actually, on every single track, I might have a little bit of gentle compression on there to adjust that. And that's also the benefit of, well, this isn't the live set anymore, but if you remember on the master chain, I had just a very, very simple EQ8 too, where you can just yank down certain frequency zones if you're hearing, based on the room or based on the speakers, all of a sudden there's way too many mids, and you can even have a simple utility, right, or even just a very, very basic EQ to kind of do quick adjustments on that. And the other big problem to solve whenever you're switching speakers, and as you get to bigger and bigger speakers, is you have to sacrifice some complexity. Because as you get bigger speakers, bigger rooms, louder, if you have too many synths or too many competing textures, it gets even more muddy. Something that you could get away with, for lack of a better word, on a headphone mix or on a small pair of studio monitors at home, might not work in festival size speakers. So actually, for some of my tracks, I've either removed parts altogether, like maybe I even had like a high pad going, or maybe I had sometimes I'll have like an arpeggiated pluck that's offset from the slightly offset from the tempo with the attack, doubling a chordal instrument. I might drop one of them, just completely cut it out, just for the sake of clarity in the sound as you go to bigger speakers, washier rooms, or even just a situation like this where the speakers are an unknown quantity, So.
This might be a silly question.
No such thing as silly questions.
There's
silly answers, but.
Besides like actually going to like renting out a concert or a venue and like putting your music full blast, are there any like ways to test out your track or like your
Oh yeah, we did it. My friend Alessandro and I, who commuted here with me, we did it in the car on the way here. So every time I'm working on mixing and mastering a record, I listen to it on my studio monitor headphones, which are balanced, in the open back ones, so that the bass is articulated. I do it on my studio monitors at home. I have a separate pair of studio monitors in the office. It sounds different there. I do it on my Sonos speakers at home, streaming from my phone. I'll do it on AirPods on my bike when I'm bike riding, and so you also get wind noise, because I listen to a lot of electronic music when I'm bike riding, and it still sounds pretty good. So I want to see how my stuff compares to, like a super polished professional label like Anjuna Deep, for example. And then I will also do it in the car. And the car is a really great way to test the loudness factor, because most car stereos will allow you to crank things up way louder than the speakers can handle. And with all of these scenarios, you want to listen at a soft, a medium, and a loud dynamic level. Because every speaker actuates in a slightly different way, and they also actuates in a slightly different way depending on the energy level being put into the speaker, because speakers have different stress tolerances. So something that sounds great at medium volume in my car, when I crank it up, all of a sudden like my bass is way too loud and my hi-hats are way too loud, for example. So and what I've learned, because I'm not coming from the background of EDM production. I'm coming from the background of jazz. And so production is something that is a constantly evolving learning process for me. What I've learned so far is that I don't think there's any way to get an absolute perfect mix in every single scenario that you would want. So when you make compromises that makes it sound better in one scenario, like on headphones, for example, you do sacrifice things with larger speakers and vice versa. And again, compression can help that, because one of the problems with mixes is simply dynamic range, right? If you have a wide dynamic range with some instruments and not with others, that will always cause you problems. And if you have a wide dynamic range overall, what you're going to find is, again, because all speakers behave slightly differently, if you have little discrepancies, they tend to grow logarithmically or exponentially as you get farther away from what you mixed it on. So let's say on my speakers at home, I've got a track and it's got a really loud sine bass. It might sound pretty balanced, but a sine wave eats up a lot of the speaker, right? And so once I put it in my car, all of a sudden I'm like, whoa, that sine bass is way too loud. Didn't sound like that on my headphones or my, and so saturation and compression across multiple tracks and across your master chain can help solve that issue to a certain degree. So, but also a lot of it is also just having a really clean track where you don't have too many things competing in the same frequency range, and making sure that you can hear the elements that you want to hear. So obviously if it's EDM and there's a kick, you're going to have to do some form of sidechain compression to the kick, because it doesn't matter how much you crank that thing, it's always going to be competing with the bass, right? Always. So, and then even on that note, I think it was Deadmau5 who said that you also, if you're doing electronic dance music, you also at a certain point have to decide what's more important, your kick or your bass, right? There's always going to be one of them that's a tiny bit more prominent, and so you just have to decide based on the vibe of the track. Are you going to pump the bass a little bit and it's going to eat up a little bit of the tail of your kick, for example, or is it going to be a more kick-heavy track and the bass is going to sit a little further back in the mix? But test, and test across multiple platforms. That's kind of my mantra for trying to mix, and I've learned a lot that way. So, yeah.
Going back to making all your tracks sound cohesive in a live set, what scenario would you try to fix it in the live set versus going back to the original session and rebouncing and redoing that whole thing, if you do come across issues or things aren't balanced the way they should be?
That's a good question, and it's kind of hard to give a single answer because it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. But basically, what I do is I A/B test. I'll take, for example, like the drops of 3 different tracks, and awesome thing with session view and the push is you can and hear them within a few seconds of each other. And what I'm listening for are big discrepancies in obviously overall dynamics. So to do this, I might turn off my compressor on the master chain temporarily, because the master chain can kind of smooth over some things and make it sound kind of okay, and you might be able to get it sound better. So maybe I'll turn off the compressor on the master chain. I'll compare different drops, and so what I'm listening for are huge dynamic discrepancies, but also I'm listening for frequency zones, and this is where it can help to just throw up a filter onto your master chain, and don't actually have any of the filters turned on, but just a visualizer so you can visualize which frequency ranges are really loud, and sometimes you can learn a lot that way, just by kind of trying to map your ears to what you're seeing visually, or vice versa. And so what I find is in my older tracks, they tend to have gaps in certain frequency ranges, so I might have like some highs that are popping and some mids and some lows, and then there will be kind of frequency range gaps in the middle that make the track just sound a little empty, for lack of a better word, or make it sound a little tinny, a little shallow. Because even if you've got a great bass, if there's something missing in the mids, sometimes people focus so much on the bass and the kick and their leads that they forget about the mids and trying to saturate the mids. So that's where I find that I've improved in both designing a track in the first place to have the right synths in the right register, and then also compressing and saturating those synths to make sure that the frequency ranges are all really, really lush and rich. So if I find a big enough discrepancy that I notice it when I'm going from one drop to the next drop, I'll try a couple quick fixes, again by maybe throwing a compressor or a saturator onto the offending track in question. And if it's bad enough that I feel I can do a lot better, at that point I'll just scrub and delete this in the session view. I'll delete the scenes that are old, and I'll have to go back, and thankfully I always keep the old files and save it under a new file name. And I do numeric system, just track name -1, -2, -3, and then do a new mix, and then go through that same process again of freezing and flattening it and slicing it into scenes, and then dragging and dropping it in, and then of course have to always go back and make sure you got the return tracks if there's any automation in the return tracks. So it is labor intensive. It's a lot of work to perform this way, but like I said, for me personally, I found It's the way that's given me the maximum flexibility to improvise, both with the arrangement and to have enough stuff that I know that's polished that I can switch between scenes that I know if I trigger that, it's going to be a polished scene and it's going to go on long enough for me to improvise or to play around with some effects. So it's obviously not the only way to do it. That's just kind of my method for how I route things for EDM stuff when I also want to improvise a little bit.
I want to see the improv chain.
Okay, so unfortunately I didn't bring my saxophone, but I do have some of my pedals. But I mean, what I basically have are some MIDI pedals. Let me load it, and then we'll talk about what's in here. So it's in this project. So, and I've been going back and editing stuff. So this one is designed to work with my Nord rather than the push, but we can still see how things are routed. So normally I'll have the saxophone, mic go through a microphone go through just like a Focusrite, for example, audio interface into the push. Yeah, so obviously there's sometimes. Oh, I see why. Let's go to preferences. Because I don't have my Focusrite plugged in, it's defaulting to the input from my laptop speaker, which obviously feeds back very, very, very quickly. So we'll just keep that track off for a second. And let me reset all effects. So again, I'll have one pedal, which is actually simply a USB pedal. So I'll pull out a USB expander. I have one that goes directly into the computer that's a USB that I've programmed just to the letter B on my touch keyboard. So when I touch the letter B, that's routed to this scene to kill all the effects. And so I can route the USB to trigger basically a B on my computer. So that's my emergency if something's getting out of hand thing there. So I've got 3 effects racks here that are all set up differently, and some of these are really, really huge. And each one of these are, again, dummy clips that have automation put into them. So I wish I had brought a microphone, because that would be the best way to just get a little bit of audio coming in. So, because I'm afraid that that we're gonna get feedback if we try and use my laptop speakers. Yeah, we're gonna get feedback in all of these.
That sounds kind of cool, though.
So lots of feedback. So this effects rack is for when I travel and I don't want to bring my analog guitar pedals. I have a third-party plugin called Guitar Rig. And so it takes up a lot of CPU, unfortunately, but I wanted to have kind of the maximum flexibility to try and imitate my live setup for analog guitar pedals. So I have a digital delay, which also doubles as a looper. I have an octavizer, I've got a harmonizer, I've got a ring modulator, and a wah pedal. So I have a series of effects racks that are nested within the larger rack here. So the first one is a Guitar Rig plugin, which basically mimics my live harmonizer. And so I can either come in directly and use the push, right, to turn any of these on or off. But I also have a series of presets. So like this one will, as it's labeled, as you can see, the automation resets, so no matter what's going on, resets all of the harmonizers to 0 and only turns on the wah. This one turns on the ring modulator. And then I have this this will double whatever I'm playing at the octave. So you can see these are just programmed to immediately, with automation, turn on what I need. This creates a sus chord below the pitch I'm playing. This creates a fifth below. This is a whole tone cluster, minor triad. So, and then I have one that mimics kind of like a phaser ring modulator with delay. And like I said, a lot of these are effects racks nested within a larger effect rack. So I can either look at it from, no pun intended, from the macro and use the macros from the macro, or of course you can select an effects rack within your larger effects rack. And then I also have a series of homemade synths. So, and these are meant to be, thank you. These are meant to be basically very versatile. So what I have are actually multiple instruments on the same synth. And what I have is, with the chain select, it fades between the various synths. So as you can see, I've actually got 3 synths. I've got a sample of kind of the vintage labyrinth sound, and then a couple of basic basses. So let me turn the filter up. So with the chain selector, I can fade from one synth to another. So it's basically 3 synths for the price of 1. And then I've just got a filter, an LFO, a reverb. This is on the bass side, controls the wobble, noise. And then I always route to, for each synthesizer, I route to this macro, what I just call kind of global oscillation, so if there's some sort of effect in that instrument. So I like that for several reasons, because it reduces the amount of switching around between tracks, because I play saxophone and I'll play the synth at the same time. And it also gives you hybrid sounds that you can play around with. So because the chain select is set as a gradual fade from each instrument to the next, you get that fade in effect. And of course you can adjust the chain if you don't want it to be that. If you want it to be just instrument, and then once you go past a certain automation value, you get a new instrument with what I call a hair trigger, so no transition, you can't. But I like having this kind of a lead synth which fades into a 108 bass, which fades into more of a wobble bass. So that's how I do that. I have to grab my interface if I want to try something with the mic, and hopefully we won't get too much feedback. So I have just a basic Focusrite. And it's going to take just a minute because I'm going to have to obviously reroute my audio. Instead of going direct, I'm going to have to reroute everything through the Focusrite. So with this setup, I could really, if I wanted to, I could really do away with, just completely do away altogether with my analog effects pedals. But I still like to do them sometimes because there's something very fun and satisfying about analog for me. But with this setup, I've essentially managed to replace all of my guitar pedals. So for example, like next month I'm going to Europe, and I'm probably not going to be able to, in my luggage, fit all my guitar pedals, plus my Ableton pedals, plus my push, plus my saxophone. It's just going to be too much stuff. So I'll probably just take Ableton and substitute that way. So our audio device to the Focusrite. And that should fix a lot of our problems. So we still got our synth. And we should be getting up mic. There we go. So I have a series of automated effects. And so most of these involve automation, which when they're played with the saxophone, sound extremely cool. So with this one, it's basically between a ring modulator, and I have drawn, in this dummy clip, I've drawn in just, some wiggles on the chorus. Sometimes I'll do it on the fine as well, and on the frequency and the LFO of the ring modulator, so that if you try and hold a single pitch, that pitch will get yanked around. Same thing with adding delay. So of course, if you have a delay signal and then you modulate the rate of delay as the signal is still coming in, you get that effect. Again, on a phaser. Lately I've been adding a lot of grain delays, which can get you some really, really interesting effects. My favorite one is the diminished chord. All of this is done with the live saxophone, of course. And then it's great to just have basic harmonizers as well, because in my duo project with the drummer, sometimes he plays piano and sometimes he plays vibraphone. We always have a vibraphone and a piano on stage. But if he's just playing drums, I'm the only person creating melody and harmony. So it's nice to harmonize myself, So, just have some chords. And the other rack here are more of just clean delays, which are also very, very hip to use with saxophone. So that's kind of how I set up a live set. So I can, of course, use any of these sort of automated presets, which are all done with automation, to just very quickly have presets that will set a ton of things on the effects racks. It's more obvious with this one, for example, when we have effects racks nested within effects racks, right? And the way I do it is I'll go through and I'll set them all to 0 in one clip, and then copy and paste that clip all the way down. That saves a lot of work. And then just go in and one at a time turn up the automation that I want to go on. So, because otherwise you have to reset all of the effects on the main rack, and then all of the racks that are nested within the main rack, which are several in this case. I have 3 racks nested within my main rack, because this one has harmonizer from the guitar rig plugin. It's got like a chorus detune effect. It's got a wah-wah plugin from the guitar rig, and then it's got an effects rack with delays, and another one with ring modulators. So as you can see, this set eats up more CPU even when it's just sitting here. I'm hovering around almost 20 CPU. And then this set also has, again, some of my home-built synthesizers, which this might be a good one to transition to talking about operator. And the last thing is it's got recordings of my drummer friend reading Pablo Neruda poetry.
En mi patria hay un monte.
So we play around with this.
En mi patria hay un río. Ven conmigo.
So that's, because that's how I got away with playing at the Latin Jazz Festival, by the way. I just had, with this wild avant-garde basically electronic noise avant-garde jazz improvisation stuff, is I had Mark read these beautiful Pablo Neruda poems with his beautiful tone of voice, and then I just destroyed them. And I chopped one of them into a drum rack as well, which is always very fun. Right? So, and the track is muted, but so chopping into drum racks is always fun. And I have, actually maybe you noticed one of the tracks that I played in my kind of warm-up set earlier actually had that with the saxophone. I had simply played a very long arpeggio on the saxophone, sliced it to a drum rack, and then created that by actually playing it on a drum rack on the push. So that's kind of a cool way to bridge that sort of gap between jazz and electronic music and improvisation. So any questions about this setup?
So do you write in all the automation, or do you ever record automation just by messing with knobs?
Good question. A mix of both, but I will more often than not write it in for that reason that I talked about, that when you have multiple effects racks nested within other effects racks, if you want to have a really clean clip that not only triggers what you want to trigger, but that resets everything, it's a lot of automation to draw in. And if you're recording, right, it's only going to record the automation that you're doing. So everything else, when you trigger a clip in Ableton, it's going to default to whatever the last settings were. So that's why I'm super conscientious about making sure that I have multiple redundancies of resetting things, because it's very easy to bump one knob or to be playing with something, and then that automation gets stuck, and then you have to go through, again, if I look at this very complicated effects rack, I have to go through
Try to figure out
the
what's
master rack, these presets, this rack, this rack, this rack. These are all right, and try and figure out which one did I bump or change and not reset. Whereas with this, I can just hit my escape pedal, right? Hit my little USB pedal, and now everything is reset, including my sends to my return track. I also reset that. The only thing I haven't gotten to the level yet, because I don't touch it that much, is volume on the tracks themselves, because I try and adjust dynamics by having a limiter or an EQ on the end of my chains. So
Is this Live 10?
yes, on my new work computer I have 11, but yeah, I haven't upgraded from 10 yet. So, and this is a pretty old computer. I bought this computer when I was still at the University of Miami, so that's at least probably 5 or 6 years ago. So this is the same set that I bought when I was the same version of Ableton that I bought when I was a student. I'm going to play around with my 11 that I have at work and see if it's worth it to upgrade to 11. But
The upgrades to the macros are pretty good.
yeah, I'll have to play around with it. Well, and there's also some more instrument interfaces as well. So
And you can
I
use
noticed.
scene follow action.
there's a lot more with. I know they have a lot more built-in like Max for Live plugins and stuff. So yeah, scene follow actions would be cool. So I'll probably do that at some point. I'm sure after playing around with 11 on my work computer, I'll want to upgrade. So I just haven't got around to it yet. Any other questions? Do you guys want to look at an EDM track, or do you want to look at operator? Those would be probably one of the next two things I would do.
Either. Those both sound great.
Okay, so.
I gotta run. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for coming in. Thanks for hanging
of
with
course.
me.
My pleasure. Thanks so much. Wish I could stay.
Do you have an EDM track where you're using operator?
Possibly. It might take me a while to find it though. Lately with 10, I've really been using Serum more than anything else. And so maybe one of these days we can look at Serum. But this is a great example of an atypical use of operator. Great for avant-garde.
Do you like Eamon Tobin?
I think I know the name, but I don't know if I've heard any music.
If you like jazz and electronica, I think
be a good artist to explore.
So, this is really only two oscillators, a sine wave modulating a sine wave. But if you notice what I did here to create this really long ramp, is to have the attack. I mean, obviously, you guys know how operator works, by the way? Do you need a quick tour of operator? Anybody?
I think we're pretty comfortable.
Cool. Yeah, so obviously with how I've routed these four oscillators, right, having a really long attack allows you to create some pretty interesting effects. So this one, the LFO, the wobbling is obviously coming from the LFO, but the really long ramp comes from the attack of the first. And then I also have mapped the chorus, right, and the fine. And because every time I have the envelope set to retrigger, so every time I attack a new note, the ramp starts over. So that's a use of operator that a lot of people don't think of, is to create really long pitch ramps. Another use, a lot of people don't think about using operator for percussion, but we can start with this wave and just change it to a noise. And if you go to your envelope, right, and just do this, this could become a snare, right? So another use of operator people don't think about is coming up with more electronic sounding percussion. And also, again, just modulating the envelope, getting a pluck, if you want to have something that's arpeggiated, So what are some of the other things I do with operator that might be atypical? Let me see. I think this might also be an operator synth. No, this is it's a pluck. This is an operator. So let's go to the. So there's different ways to create wobble, right? If you ever want a wob bass. This one is done by, well, it is routed to the B oscillator. And so this one I've set it up almost more of an additive synth. But I've routed the LFO to the filter. And so that's one way to create a wob bass, right? And it's routed to one of these oscillators. Let me hide the chain selector. It's probably, yeah, so the global on my master chain macro, what I've labeled global oscillation is linked to the LFO here. So, and we're also getting, obviously, the pitch modulation because of, there's a pitch envelope as well. So, what do you guys usually use operator for? What type of operations? What type of sounds are you guys using, trying to create operator with? Did I give you at least a few new ones?
Yeah, I think that idea of coming up with really long envelopes
Yeah.
is pretty
So,
unique.
I can show you some more that I've done, because for a while I was really only doing. I went down the rabbit hole, and I made a ton of presets that we can go through some of these to just look at some of the variety that you can get. So I'm just gonna drop some of these in here. So. So this one has a pitch envelope, which which is what's giving you that pitch bend at the attack. The modulation is coming from a combination of the square modulating a sine wave. That's what's giving us the buzz, and there's also an LFO, which is routed to all the oscillators and the filter. So if we take them off and just route it to the filter and crank up the amount, you can get, again, it's a way to get a wah. And if I wanted to make a long ramp, again, I could take the envelope of this one and really drag it out and get something a little more. So long ramps are really powerful with operator. I've got several presets. Here's an example of, again, using operator more for creating something rhythmic. So it's a sine wave with obviously an extremely short attack that gets the tweedy sound because it's being modulated by a square wave, and there's an LFO, which is also modulating all the oscillators. A bouncy LFO. So what was creating the bounce here? It's probably the LFO. So again, the oscillators themselves are just a sine wave at the attack to give the attack body, right? And as you can see, I've routed it as essentially additive synthesis. And so it's basically just a detuned, as you can see, the spread is cranked up. It's a detuned square wave with a sine wave at the attack, which gives you that almost like a French horn type of an attack, and then just an LFO to give me a different type of wobble. Let's find some examples. So again, using operator for noise. It's a subtle, like if you want white noise in your track, this would be like a cricket noise. So again, there's a sine wave at the attack, and then just a square wave, filtered extremely high, detuned. Right? If you want to make some electronic music with some noise, again, a snare. So this one has a white noise with a very sharp attack, a tiny bit of sustain, and I've set the envelope to loop in basically 8-note triplets. 124, right? 8-note triplets. I'm not good at math. 8-note triplets, yeah. 124 is 8-note triplets. Siren bass. Similar to the other one we heard. Funky bass. Again, this one's a wobble created by modulating the oscillators themselves, but of course you could reroute your LFO to a filter. And create a wobble that way. So a lot of these things will also, I like to use them for creating rhythm when I'm, again, improvising with a drummer, in case the drummer goes to the piano or the vibraphone. And also, this can be a substitute for a sidechain, by the way. If you want an alternate way of getting a sidechain, you can obviously set your LFO to triangle, right? And since it's synced, and by changing the envelope, you're going to obviously get a slightly different attack and decay on what I'm now calling a sidechain, which is obviously not a sidechain. It's the filter being modulated by an LFO, but gives you a different attack. So this could be like a poor man's substitute for creating the illusion of a sidechain without actually having to use a compressor, because some people don't like the after effects, like the knock-on effects of a compressor, and compressors can be a little bit fiddly sometimes if you're trying to get the sidechain attack and release to really connect with your tempo and the rhythm that you're going for. So that's part of the reason why I very often use a third-party plugin. I use Nicky Romero's Kickstart. It's just a glorified LFO tool essentially, but it's got very easy presets, so I use that just to save myself the time. But you don't need a plugin to create sidechain like effects without having to rely on a compressor. So here's an example of a sub bass I built in Operator with a little bit of buzz, a little bit of dynamics. So, and one of the ways that I learned a lot about Operator, and because as you can see I've got multiple versions of these same fundamental sounds, is I would try and create a sound and then tweak each variable one at a time until I got it to do something I liked. And one of the first places to go is to really start to understand the difference of routing. When you have 4 oscillators modulating each other, crazy stuff can happen. So that's the difference between these 4 oscillators essentially working as additive versus modulating each other. Right? Now we've got only D modulating C, right? D modulating all 3 other of them. So growls, if you want something growly, and really, 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 really grungy. First of all, the oscillators, I've detuned them with the fine setting, and then there's also some spread in the pitch envelope, and then there's an LFO. So if you want something really growly or buzzy, and I like to play around with, in my synths, routing the fine of the oscillator, the fine tuning of the oscillator, to a macro, because it's, again, if you're into something avant-garde, or even if you're just into really like loud, noisy, aggressive electronic music, you can create a lot of interesting colors and textures just by changing the fine setting. And then again, if we reroute these so that, let's have B oscillator B modulate A. Oh well, A is a sharp attack, so let's have A sustain. You can create a lot of interesting consonance and dissonance within a single synth and get this huge variety of complexity without having to have multiple synths. Here's some other examples of risers. We were talking about risers. Here's a 10-second riser. So let's see. Some longer risers. Let's look at this one with no wobble. So we'll look at the envelopes here. You can create some interesting effects. My airplane landing is one that I'm very fond of. So that's the use of operator that some people don't really think about, creating risers. And then, then a lot of sort of basic basic synths, you can create a lot of sounds. You know, what I tend to use operator for, because you're starting with super simple waveforms, I tend to use it for more vintage sounding synths, like relatively simple. So I mean, right there, that's a huge variety of sounds. All right. So, what else do I use operator for? And then, of course, you know, you can always nest it in a rack and start adding effects and mapping macros. And so that's what I've done with some of my synths, right? And obviously, you can route multiple things to the same macro. So again, if you've got a setup like here, where you've got multiple instruments on the same chain, you can really get a lot of bang for your buck by having each instrument that's on a separate part of the chain route multiple effects to the same macro. And so that's something that people will also sometimes overlook with operator, is that any one of these you could map to a macro if you wanted to. Including, you could have multiple operators, instruments on the same chain and map macros. Cool. I guess so. Maybe the last thing is to look at maybe a kind of a deep house track. Do you want to look at something that's got a saxophone that's chopped into an effects rack, or do you want to look at something that's a little more traditional, something with an ARP?
The effects room.
Cool, let's look at something with the saxophone. Let's pull out Luft, but not a frozen version. So, like I said, I have a lot of tracks that have the saxophone actually live recorded, but in this case, you can see I've got MIDI data, but I'm calling this sax. Well, that's because it is the saxophone. A lot of distortion there. Let me just yank everything down here. Let's check out this saxophone track. So I built the track around this. Let's go somewhere with the breakdown. So this is another thing that sometimes people overlook, which is the possibility of using either acoustic instrument sounds or even completely bounced tracks or a stem of a synthesizer, anything you want that's audio. Of course, you can slice it up into a drum rack with Ableton. In this case, I had the settings so that it would just track the transients and slice it by transient. And then once you have a slice, of course, you can polish it. So with all of them, I have a little bit of a fade into the attack, because the saxophone, naturally has a little bit of a fade in its attack. And so if you chop a saxophone melody right down the middle, in the middle of a tone, it can sound not only unnatural, but more importantly, the attack has almost a click quality to it, and I wanted to smooth that out. And that's a great way, for me at least, to break out of sort of like a compositional and production rut, is instead of relying on the same type of synths I've been doing before, or as a saxophone player, instead of relying on the things that I know I can do with my fingers, I'll just record an arpeggio. In this case, I think I just recorded like a 2-octave major 7 add 9 arpeggio, slice it into a drum rack, and then see what I can come up with there. And for me, like I said, also it helps to bridge the gap between, a lot of people have, in the jazz world, have kind of an allergy, a built-in bias against electronic music. And some people in the electronic world don't think that the saxophone is worth anything except for like a couple little cheesy melodies in the middle of your EDM track, right, to complement the vocals. But I think that this could be true for any instrument, including live drums, slicing live drums, and even entire tracks. So the hard part is mixing and making these things sound natural. And so my saxophone tracks end up being really, really messy. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff on here. There's an auto pan, a delay, multiband compression. I've got a gate, which is sidechain to the kick, which is helping also to create some of the rhythmic texture that you're hearing, because the saxophone is really rhythmic. Right, and then a little bit of reverb. And so if I start to take these things out, and take out my, and I drop it back in the mix. It sits too far back in the mix. So the one thing I've learned from doing this for a while is that the way to get acoustic instruments to really fit with this loud, noisy, oversaturated, overcompressed style of dance music that I'm kind of trying to achieve is that you have to apply a lot of effects. At the very least, some form of compression and reverb and delay, because I record in a very dry home studio. So the saxophone sounds way too dry. And if you try and record with reverb in the room, then the audio gets messy as you try to apply digital reverb or digital compression, because you can't go back and it's very hard to go back and scrub out the reverb. You can do it with like a noise filter, and Ableton even has a noise reducer preset with its multiband compression tool. But so that's kind of the style that I've come around to with the saxophone, is using the saxophone more like a synthesizer than like a saxophone, and that's kind of how I've tried to carve a somewhat unique style or approach to incorporating the saxophone into electronic music. So, and I think it can probably exist without it. I think this track would probably be almost complete without the saxophone. And as a matter of fact, in this entire section, I just faded the saxophone out. But it can also sit in the mix without being the main feature, So it like I said, treating it like a synthesizer, where it feels like it sits naturally in the mix, almost as if it were an electronic instrument. So that's kind of my style when I use the saxophone. Cool. I guess we're kind of out of time, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. It
Thanks
was
for
fun.
being
I hope
here.
everybody learned a little bit of something. I always learn something every time I do something like this. So, cool. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. It's always great seeing how